What if we could make every single moral decision with just one simple goal, to create the most happiness for the most people? I mean, that's the grand ambition of utilitarianism. It's an idea that's all about making the world a better, happier place. But, as we're about to find out, that beautifully simple goal hides some truly mind-bending challenges. Just imagine having one single principle, like a moral calculator, that could just cut through any dilemma and tell you exactly the right thing to do. That is the incredible promise of utilitarianism, one universal rule to guide every ethical choice we ever have to make. So, what is this master rule? Well, at its core, utilitarianism argues that the most ethical action is whichever one maximizes overall happiness and minimizes suffering. The focus isn't on your personal gain or, some ancient tradition. It's all about the total well-being of everyone involved. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? But oh boy, the devil is in the details.
The real genius of early thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill was to base morality on something they thought was totally universal: our shared desire for pleasure and our need to avoid pain. They saw this as a way to slice right through all the complicated cultural and religious debates. At the end of the day, suffering is suffering, no matter who you are or what you believe.
But here we hit the first major hurdle. If your goal is to maximize happiness, then you have to be able to measure it first, right? You need some way to put a number on joy and compare different possible outcomes. And that seemingly simple task opens up a massive can of worms.
So this brings us to what's called the measurement problem. Seriously, how do you put a number on something as personal and subjective as happiness? Are all pleasures and pains even comparable? This is the core challenge of commensurability.
Just look at how this slide frames it. Is the pleasure you get from a really great cup of coffee simply the positive end of a scale that has the agony of a kidney stone at the negative end? Or are these just fundamentally different kinds of experiences that you can't possibly measure with the same ruler? And this reveals the next layer of the problem, because even if you could perfectly measure your own joy, how could you possibly compare it to someone else's? As the economist W.S. Jevons pointed out, we have no way of knowing if another person's capacity for feeling is 1,000 times greater than our own. There's just no way to get inside another person's head and take a reading. Okay, so to get around this whole measurement mess, utilitarians came up with a pretty clever shift. Instead of trying to measure internal feelings, what if we focused on something we can actually observe? What people want, what they desire. The thinking here is pretty simple. A good life is a life where your desires get satisfied. This seems way easier to track, right? We can just ask people what they want. But this elegant solution runs into a pretty big and honestly a pretty strange problem.
It turns out, people can want things that are just plain irrational, or even bad for them. The philosopher Derek Parfit came up with this amazing thought experiment to show this. Imagine someone who is totally indifferent to agony, but only on future Tuesdays. Now, if we satisfy their desire by letting them suffer on a Tuesday, have we really made their life better? Of course not. It's an irrational desire.
And this is where John Stuart Mill comes in with his famous distinction. He argued that, look, not all pleasures are equal. There are higher pleasures, things like art, intellect, and morality, and they are qualitatively better than the lower, purely physical pleasures that we might share with, say, a pig.
But notice what happens here. In trying to solve the problem of bad desires, Mill accidentally drags us right back to the measurement problem. How in the world do you compare the utility of loving your children with gaining knowledge? We're not comparing apples and oranges anymore. We're trying to compare apples and existential fulfillment. We're totally stuck again.
All right, let's tackle another really powerful objection. This one from the philosopher Robert Nozick. He created this famous thought experiment to ask a really fundamental question. Is a life filled with nothing but pleasurable experiences really what we want? Okay, here's the setup. Imagine a machine that can simulate any experience you could ever want. You could feel what it's like to write a masterpiece, or climb Mount Everest, or find your one true love. It promises a lifetime of guaranteed happiness. The only catch? None of it is real. So the big question is, would you plug in for life? Nozick was pretty sure that most of us would say no. And his point is that we value more than just pleasant feelings. We want to actually accomplish things. We want to build real relationships and become a certain kind of person. We value reality itself, not just a perfect simulation of it. And this suggests that happiness, or desirable consciousness, can't be the only thing that matters. This leads us to what many people think is the most devastating objection to utilitarianism.
If the only goal is to maximize total happiness, does that mean it's okay to do truly terrible things to a few people as long as it benefits a bigger group?
Let's just look at the raw numbers here. Option C, yeah, that's a clear improvement. But then you have option D. The net utility is astronomical, a gain of 97,000. The catch is, it requires inflicting extreme, agonizing suffering on 3 innocent people. A cold, hard utilitarian calculation would say that option D is the morally required choice.
This gets right to the heart of the separateness of persons objection. A society isn't one giant person that can sacrifice a little bit of itself for its own greater good. No, it's made up of separate individuals, each with their own life to live. Does any moral theory really have the right to treat some of those lives as just resources for the happiness of others?
Now, with objections this powerful, you might think utilitarianism is totally cooked, but its defenders have a really sophisticated response. They argue that we've been applying the core principle in the wrong way this whole time.
The whole defense really hinges on a change in perspective. Instead of asking, what single act creates the most happiness right now, we should be asking, what set of rules, if followed by everyone, will create the most happiness in the long run? This is the core idea behind what's called rule utilitarianism.
This brings us right back to John Stuart Mill. He argued that personal security is the absolute bedrock of all happiness. Without it, you can't plan for the future, you can't truly enjoy anything, because you're living in constant fear that someone might just decide to harm you for their own benefit.
And this is the core of the defense. A society where anyone could be sacrificed for the greater good would be a terrifying place to live. The constant fear and anxiety would lead to a massive net loss of happiness for everyone. So a smart utilitarian would argue for strong rules that protect individual rights, because those very rules are what ultimately produce the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run.
So Mill used this exact same logic to argue for things we care about today, like free speech and individual liberty. He believed that letting people experiment with different ways of living, even if they make mistakes, would ultimately teach us all what truly leads to a flourishing life, maximizing happiness for generations to come. In a way, he kind of started a huge experiment with Western liberal democracies. And the question for us today is, a century and a half later, how is that experiment going?